Good evening, and welcome to this special edition of Bibliotherapy Live tonight, whose subject is plague and pestilence. I'm doing these sessions every Wednesday night. Hi, Tate, great to see you back here. And I'm taking a different theme every week and would love your thoughts on what themes you'd like me to tackle. But this week, I thought I'd focus on plagues and pestilence because a lot of people have been reading about these ideas during this period of the pandemic. And I thought it would be a really good issue to talk about. And I've also been reading some of those books myself. So I'd like to start by just briefly touching on some of the cures that people thought would cure the plague back in the time of the bubonic plague in 1361 to 4. So some people used onions, which they rubbed all over their bodies. They applied herbs and they also burnt herbs around them. They might chop up a snake and apply it to the boils. They also cut up a pigeon and rubbed it over their infected bodies. And they also sometimes even put the bottom of a chicken on their buboes as well. And they even strapped parts of dead birds to their bodies, all of which we now would clearly find deeply worrying. But in those days, they didn't really know any of the causes. And they also killed all of the cats and dogs in their villages because they believed that the cats and dogs were carriers of the plague. And actually, they were horribly wrong about that because the cats would have caught the rats, which would have stopped the plague. Well, they wouldn't have completely stopped the plague because, as we know, it was highly infectious. So it's kind of interesting to think about those weird and wonderful cures that people used. And they come into a lot of the literature that we read about the plague as well. One of the most recent novels that I've read about the plague is Hamnet by Maggie O'Farrell, which is about the tragic death of Shakespeare's son, Hamnet, who died of the plague very tragically. And uh, she mentions one of those strange cures when they tried to strap a dead sparrow, I think, to his body to try and keep the plague warded off him, and it didn't work. It's really lovely to see you here, Ollie. Great to see you. Tate, lovely to see you. Helen, great to see you too. It's really nice having people coming back every week. So do keep on coming. And by the way, while I think about it, next week I'm going to be going back to Damien Barr's literary salon page. So I'm going to be there once a month. And the theme next week is going to be on how to sort out your library. So it's something that quite a lot of people might have been doing during this period of being stuck at home, culling their library, trying to reorganize their library. And I'd love to know your thoughts on how you might be doing that too. So back to plagues. One of the first great works of literature about the plague is the Decameron, which is a collection of novellas written by the 14th century Italian author Giovanni Boccaccio, who lived from 1313 to 1375. This is a particularly wonderful work of literature to read now because it's structured as a frame story containing 100 tales told by a group of 7 young women and 3 young men who are sheltering in a secluded villa just outside Florence to escape the Black Death. So you can imagine the scene, a wonderful villa, beautiful young men and women. They all get together, and every night they have to tell a different story, and they play a kind of game in which they enjoy making up stories, and they're given subjects, and the subjects are all ideas like examples of the power of fortune, examples of the power of the human will, love tales that end tragically, love tales that end happily, clever replies that save the speaker, tricks that women play on men, tricks that men play on women, and so on. So the idea for the Decameron is a really fantastic one. And I've just seen the comment from Tate saying, can I put the list up on my page at the end like last week? I will certainly do that. And I got some really excellent books, which I'm sure you're all going to want to read. And I wonder if anyone will be able to read them all in one week. That would be pretty amazing. And I will be quite thrilled if you do. So the Decameron, that's an amazing piece of literature, which obviously we're going to be reading in translation one way or another because it was written back in about 1348. And the experience of reading it is it's a bit like binge watching on Netflix, sex education or similar, because it's stories within stories, and each story is an interesting, fascinating tale, but they're also hung together by this idea of all being in the same villa. It's a similar idea to Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, and Chaucer indeed took a lot of his ideas from Boccaccio's Decameron, and he in fact retold quite a lot of those stories. And Boccaccio himself was actually taking stories from previous works of literature. So no one should ever be ashamed of stealing stories from other people. I think it's something that everyone does. All great writers steal stories from other great writers. And if people were doing it back in the 1340s, then why not carry on doing it now? Another really fantastic work of plague related literature is Daniel Defoe's Journal of the Plague Year. And I know a lot of people have been buying that recently because a lot of the shops were lacking it on their shelves, even at the beginning of when the lockdown began. But you can still get it online. So Daniel Defoe was known in his day as a bit of a hack author. He was very good at responding to what was happening in his own time. And he wrote the Journal of the Plague Year in 1722 in response to an outbreak of the plague in 1720 in Marseille. So people of the time wanted to know what it was like to live through a plague. And that brings me to one of the questions that we're asking tonight. Why do we enjoy reading novels about the plague when we are living in our own pandemic? Well, one of the reasons is that we want to see that other people have lived through plagues and survived. And the great thing about novels and great works of poetry or extended novellas like the Decameron is that they're always written with some people surviving. So there's a sense of survival through reading these novels. There's also the idea that a plague is not unprecedented. We're living through a pandemic now, and we know that these pandemics are not unprecedented. Other people have lived through them before and lived to tell the tale. So people do survive, and people are bonded together by the experience. So as with Boccaccio's Decameron, in which people are drawn together into a beautiful villa where they all come together to share stories, people in modern novels and in Defoe's Journal of the Plague Year are bonded together by the experience of having to survive the plague. So Defoe's Journal of the Plague Year was written very much as if he himself witnessed the events. Defoe was very clever at doing that, and he did the same when he wrote Robinson Crusoe. He made it sound as if he had heard the words of Robinson Crusoe from the man himself. We all know now that it was fiction, but at the time, a lot of people would have believed it. So Defoe's Journal of the Plague Year is written with an amazingly vivid sense of happening right now, though the events that Defoe describes would have in reality happened when he was about 5 years old. So although he claims to have witnessed many of the events, he couldn't really have seen most of them, but he extrapolated from registries, the bill notices which proclaimed how many people had died, and so on. So he was amazingly clever in the way that he put these facts together. And I'm going to read you a couple of extracts from Defoe's Journal of the Plague Year so that you can get a flavour of it. And also, I noticed, Tate, you were asking earlier, are some of these older books difficult to read because of their language? I would say no, partly because we can now read them in slightly modernized versions, but even when you read the original Defoe, they actually sound incredibly vivid and alive, and as if they could have been spoken by someone right now, with only some of the words sounding a bit archaic. So here's a little bit of Defoe's Journal of the Plague Year. It was a very ill time to be sick in, for if anyone complained, it was immediately said he had the plague. And though I had indeed no symptom of that distemper, yet being very ill, both in my head and in my stomach, I was not without apprehension that I really was infected. But in about 3 days, I grew better. The third night I rested well, sweated a little, and was much refreshed. The apprehensions of its being the infection went also quite away with my illness, and I went about my business as usual. It was now mid-July, and the plague, which had chiefly raged at the other end of the town, and as I said before, in the parishes of St Giles, St Andrews, Holborn, and towards Westminster, began to now come eastwards towards the part where I lived. A lot of people believed at the time that the plague was never going to reach the east end of London, and so they didn't actually leave the town, whereas many people from the west end of London had all gone to their country seats. But unfortunately, the East End was in the end ravaged. It was to be observed, indeed, that it did not come straight on towards us, for the city, that is to say, within the walls, was indifferently healthy still, nor was it got then very much over the water into Southwark. For though there died that week 1,268 of all distempers, whereof it might be supposed above 600 died of the plague, yet there was but 28 in the whole city within the walls, and but 19 in Southwark, Lambeth parish included. Whereas in the parishes of St Giles and St Martin's in the Fields alone, there died 421. One of the things that's interesting about Defoe and the way he writes about the plague is he loves putting in the statistics and the numbers of deaths, which he had got from all these notices that were put up in the streets, because every night notices were put up all around London saying how many people had died that day. And perhaps one might make a parallel that as then and now, people initially didn't want to believe that many of the deaths were related to the plague itself. They denied that they were plague deaths. They said, oh, they were just dying of other issues, normal things that could have happened to people in those times, when actually they were indeed because of the plague. So there's a lot of denial that goes on, and that's one of the great parallels that we can find in older literature. Just as we do now, we tend to at first deny that a terrible thing is happening, a pandemic is sweeping around our globe, and we would rather carry on, act normal, get on with our business, which is exactly what happens in Daniel Defoe's Journal of the Plague Year. And so many more people die unnecessarily because they don't want to admit that it's the plague that's coming to them. I'll just give you one more little extract of Defoe before I move on to Edgar Allan Poe. One day, being in that part of town, that's the East End, on some special business, curiosity led me to observe things more than usually, and indeed I walked a great way where I had no business. I went up to Holborn, and there the street was full of people, but they walked in the middle of the great street, neither on one side or the other, because, as I suppose, they would not mingle with anybody that might come out of the houses, or meet with smells and scent from houses that might be infected. Reading that passage made me think of us social distancing and doing our strange dance that we have to do around each other when we're walking down the local roads or in the supermarket. So even then, back in the time that Defoe was writing about, which was actually 1665, people were social distancing in their own way once they realised that that's what they had to do. Defoe is still hailed as one of the greatest writers about the plague ever because he caught so much detail, and he obviously really rather revelled in enjoying the pestilence and the nasty details of people jumping out of their windows in terror, screaming, "Death, death, death," which he rather deeply, lavishly enjoys laying on with a trowel. But he also writes with a great vernacular ease and makes us feel as if it really is happening today. So I really strongly recommend Journal of the Plague Year. It's also not a long book. So the next one I want to mention, which is a great plague book, is The Masque of the Red Death by Edgar Allan Poe, which was written in 1842. So this is another one, a bit like Boccaccio's Decameron, in which the aristocrats are all trying to avoid the hordes of commoners who are dying of the plague, and they set up their own little idyll, so they believe, in the walls of an abbey. So in this story, Prince Prospero and 1,000 other nobles have taken refuge in a walled abbey to escape the Red Death. The Red Death is a fictional plague made up by Edgar Allan Poe, and he describes it as a terrible plague with gruesome symptoms that has swept over the land. Victims are overcome by sharp pains, sudden dizziness, and profuse bleeding at the pores. Sounds pretty horrible. And they die within half an hour, so it's very rapid. Prospero and his court stay in their castle indifferent to the suffering of the other people outside. And Prospero decides to hold an enormous masquerade ball in his castle one night. He decorates each of the 6 rooms in his castle in a specific colour: blue, purple, green, orange, white, and violet. The last room is decorated in a deep blood red, and it's decorated in black, but it's illuminated by a red light which is cast with terrible shadows through a kind of brazier which is on fire. There's a huge ebony clock that stands in the room and ominously chimes every hour. And once the chiming begins, everyone stops moving and dancing. And then once it stops, they all dance again. So here we are in the Masque of the Red Death, with Prospero reveling with all of his courtiers, when in walks a man all dressed in black. I'm going to read you what he looks like, because this is one of the lovely bits about Edgar Allan Poe that he writes so beautifully about the way the Red Death emerges into this strange place. Sorry, I've just lost where I am. At the chiming of midnight, the revellers and Prospero notice a figure in a dark, blood-spattered robe resembling a funeral shroud. The figure's mask resembles the rigid face of a corpse and exhibits the traits of the Red Death. Gravely insulted, Prospero demands to know the identity of the mysterious guest so they can hang him. The guests are too afraid to approach the figure, and instead they let him pass through the 6 chambers. So I just want to read a little bit from the actual story. It's actually such a brilliant story that I would very much recommend to people reading it aloud if you've got anyone captive who will listen to a rather terrifying and chilling story by Edgar Allan Poe, because it's actually a story that will only take probably half an hour to read aloud. You can find the story online. It's actually on the Gutenberg website. And it really isn't a long story, but it's amazingly atmospheric and really very chilling, but wonderfully so. Now, where is my lovely section that I want to read to you? I'm just going to read you a random passage because I can't find the actual one that I want, but this will give you a sense of his language. It was in this apartment also that there stood against the western wall a gigantic clock of ebony. Its pendulum swung to and fro with a dull, heavy, monotonous clang. And when the minute hand made the circuit of the face, and the hour was to be stricken, there came from the brazen lungs of the clock a sound which was clear and loud and deep and exceedingly musical, but of so peculiar a note and emphasis that, at each lapse of an hour, the musicians of the orchestra were constrained to pause momentarily in their performance to hearken to the sound, and thus the waltzers perforce ceased their evolutions, and there was a brief disconcert of the whole gay company. And while the chimes of the clock yet rang, it was observed that the giddiest grew pale, and the more aged and sedate passed their hands over their brows, as if confused in reverie or meditation. But when the echoes had fully ceased, a light laughter at once pervaded the assembly. The musicians looked at each other and smiled at their own nervousness and folly, and made whispering vows, each to the other, that the next chiming of the clock should produce in them no similar emotion. And then, after the lapse of 60 minutes, which embrace 3,600 seconds of the time that flies, there came yet another chiming of the clock, and then were the same disconcert and tremulousness and meditation as before. You can probably imagine where the story is going. It's Death himself who comes into Prince Prospero's hall, his little castle, and he walks through each of the chambers, the green, the orange, the violet, and finally the black chamber. And Prospero, I better not give it away, had I? I won't tell you the end. You're going to have to read it yourselves. But it is a brilliant story. You can imagine it's not going to end well. It is an Edgar Allan Poe story after all, but it is a fantastic one. And even though you know that it's macabre and dark and essentially about mortality coming our way, it's a story to really revel in. And it has all those aspects that I was talking about earlier, the reasons why we love reading a plague book is partly to feel that it's happened before, people have survived. But then the other reason, which is more relevant to the Edgar Allan Poe, is that some plagues are far worse than the ones that we are going through ourselves. And when you read a story like the Edgar Allan Poe, it gives us a shudder, but it makes us feel glad that we do have ways of combating our current pandemic, and we're lucky enough to have the NHS, for instance. Moving on from Edgar Allan Poe, so that was back in 1840 that he was writing that. I'm leaping 100 years to the next fantastic piece of plague literature, which is The Plague by Albert Camus, written in 1942. Now, this is often read as a kind of commentary on the Nazi occupation of France, but it can also be read at face value as a novel purely and simply about the plague. It's all set in a town called Oran, which is a lovely town where everyone is just getting on with their business. And just as in Defoe's Journal of the Plague Year and many another pandemic, real or fictional, people at first don't believe that anything really serious or bad is happening. And so they ignore the warning signs and get on with their lives. But slowly, rats begin to appear in the town and die in a sinister fashion. And the plague is upon them. And soon, the people of the town are either dying or living in quarantine, and a terrible boredom and ennui comes to them. This is a really bleak novel. Uh, Camus is not renowned for being someone full of joy and delight, but it is actually a book which does celebrate humanity sharing our lives, sharing our time together, and making the most of conversation, togetherness while we can. In a way, Camus makes a kind of conclusion that life is a hospice, never a hospital. He's trying to give us a sense of seizing the day, making the most of life while we can, and rising above our own worst natures. He does show the way that the plague chooses people randomly, has no rhyme or reason, and there's a terrible pointlessness and misery to this fact. But people that love the book do find hope and positivity within it. It is a book that's not for everyone to read right now, but I know a lot of people are reading it and seeking solace within its pages. So I'm now going to talk about a book that I have always loved, which is one that I recommend a lot in ordinary life, not just in times of pandemic, which is Blindness by Jose Saramago, which was written in 1998. And that's a book which very much celebrates love between husband and wife. And although it does have a terrible bleakness to it too, like the Camus novel, it also does have a tremendous warmth. And as with many of the other novels, it very much brings people together. So it shows us both the best and the worst of humanity. Blindness is a novel that I wrote about in my book, The Novel Cure, that I wrote with Susan Elderkin, my wonderful co-writer. And we use blindness as a cure for fear of commitment. And you'll see why it will become evident when I read you this passage, which describes blindness. I will just tell you a little bit more about it before I start. Blindness is a novel about a pandemic, and it's a pandemic in which people lose their sight. It's set in an unnamed Latin American country, and we never know quite where it is. But all the things that happen in it are very much, in a way, similar to what's happening now. But it is a book which I think shows an amazing strength of the power of love between husband and wife, and also between complete strangers. So here's an extract from The Novel Cure about blindness. When you begin a sentence by the Portuguese writer Jose Saramago, you are making a commitment to follow it wherever it goes, because this ingenious writer does not follow the normal rules of grammar, but uses commas in unexpected ways, ways which will have your inner grammarian's jaw dropping open, on your outer one reaching for his or her red pen. Surely that was a clause, and this is another. Shouldn't there be a full stop in between, or at the very least a semicolon? And your inner and outer grammarians are right, of course, but Saramago is right as well. He knows exactly what he's doing. And by the end of the first two paragraphs, he will have you hopelessly ensnared by these sentences, which flow from one to the other with an unstoppability that mimics the silent and terrifying epidemic of blindness, which gives this novel its title, and the cause of which nobody can explain. Take a breath there. You can see from that paragraph that we were emulating the way that Saramago writes, because he writes with little or no grammar, and his sentences are very long and string together from one clause to the next. I'm going to read you a bit more because it does give you a great flavour of the novel, which I do really very much love. Because in an unnamed city at an unspecified moment in history, the inhabitants begin to go blind, quite suddenly, one by one. And as the narrative moves between one unnamed character and the next, from the young prostitute with the dark glasses to the car thief to the ophthalmologist and his wife, so we submit to the surreal and powerful accumulation of sentences and any resistance to Saramago's unconventional style that we might have felt at the start is soon forgotten. Because the rewards of commitment, whether to a sentence, a novel, a relationship, or indeed to anything you believe may have value and which you decide to believe in, are great, as is about to be demonstrated within the story of blindness itself. For in the mental asylum where the blind are quarantined in an attempt to stem the epidemic, and where armed guards stand at the gates ready to shoot should anyone try to escape, conditions quickly descend into squalor and disrule as the helpless inmates fight over the limited rations of food. And in the midst of all this, the wife of the ophthalmologist looks after her husband tenderly, carefully, devotedly. In a moment of great foresight, which shines out from all the horror, the eye doctor's wife, her vision mysteriously intact, has managed to inveigle her way into the asylum with him, pretending to be blind herself so that she can stay by her husband's side. When he has been to the toilet, she washes him. When he needs to move, she guides him. She realizes that if anyone discovers she is sighted, they might use her to their own ends, and so she takes great care to continue to act as if blind, not just to protect herself, but also so that she continue to look after her husband. The invisible actions of the wife are the actions of a woman for whom loyalty, love, and commitment come first, and are not questioned. From the moment the blindness strikes her husband, the doctor's wife is fighting first for him and then the others who share their ward, because by dint of being the first to go blind, this group, which includes the ophthalmologist and the prostitute, form a familial bond, one that is maintained and strengthened by acts of kindness and support, and by finding humour and hope in amongst the hell. It leaves us in no doubt that if they survive, it will be because of their commitment to one another. It is also what enables them to keep their humanity while everyone around is losing theirs. So that's why I love the novel Blindness. Saramago did write a sequel to the novel called Seeing quite a long time later. It was actually his last book. And he wrote that really with a somewhat depressing conclusion, it has to be said. So Blindness, the one that I've just been describing, is really an amazing book. It's hard-hitting, it's dark, and it's a bit grim, but it does have quite a lot of positivity and joy within it. But Seeing is in some ways a darker and bleaker novel, but also an excellent one, which I strongly recommend, which has more political negativity. And in some ways, it might be even more apt for the events that are happening at the moment. So if you are feeling up to reading something bleak, then that's a good one to go for. However, we don't just want to read bleak novels at this time. We also want to read antidotes to the plague. So I'm just going to give you one last thought from Orhan Pamuk, the Nobel Prize winner, Turkish novelist who is currently writing a book, funnily enough, called Nights of Plague, which is forthcoming. I think he's actually still writing it, and he has been writing some fantastic commentary in the New Yorker. And I got this thought from Orhan Pamuk while he's thinking about the plague and how it affects us. He says, very recently, probably only about a week ago, the knowledge that the whole of humanity, from Thailand to New York, shares our anxieties about how and where to use a face mask, the safest way to deal with the food we have brought from the grocer, and whether to self-quarantine, is a constant reminder that we are not alone. It begets a sense of solidarity. We are no longer mortified by our fear. We discover a humility in it that encourages mutual understanding. So that is actually a rather positive thought from Orhan Pamuk, which I'm going to end the rather more negative plague books that we've been talking about. And before I end the session for tonight, I just want to mention the more upbeat and positive antidotes to the plague. So I felt that the kind of books that would be great antidotes to the plague would be ones in which people are doing the opposite of self-isolation. So big family sagas, possibly books with extreme physical intimacy, books which are happy, upbeat and positive. So I've got a few suggestions. One which has a lot of close physical proximity and is a great big epic book is Gravity's Rainbow by Thomas Pynchon, which has a very famous orgy scene in it. And it's also quite a funny, mad, strange, bizarre, wonderful book. Another one which is more of a family saga and a book that I've always loved, it's close to my heart, is Gerald Durrell's My Family and Other Animals, which is a book that I do recommend to quite a lot of clients because it's such a lovely book about a family growing up on an island in Corfu, which is pretty much where we would probably all like to be right now, self-isolating in a villa with lots of animals, running free, being with nature. That is that book in a nutshell. And it's also a memoir. It's a true story, which makes it all the more fun. And Durrell wrote several sequels to the book, which all have names like A Zoo in My Suitcase and Bats in My Belfry or something like that. And they're all books about the joy of working with animals. So Gerald Durrell, he's a great one to hang out with when self-isolating. Another lovely family saga that people are reading a lot at the moment and loving still is the Cazalet Chronicles by Elizabeth Jane Howard, which is a collection of books which span 60 years from the First World War to the Second, I think. And it's 5 books, and it takes one particular family and goes through all the relationships between the different people from the elder to the youngest. It's a very English book. It's very much an aristocratic kind of book with people living through wars and having to go off to war, some losing their lives, some losing their minds, but also remaining together and being a united family. So it's a book that's written from another era, which makes it a lovely book to escape into. Also, 100 Years of Solitude, thinking of big family sagas by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, is another wonderful book which spans many generations. It has lots of confusing names and many people who come and go in the story. It's a magic realist book, so people do mad things like disappear into a cloud of yellow butterflies or are too beautiful to live on this earth and so ascend into the heavens miraculously. but it is a book that's full of joy and physical intimacy, which is what a lot of people are missing at the moment, let's face it. So, on that upbeat note, I'd love to ask you to leave comments of any books that you've been reading and loving during this time, whether they are books about pandemics, books about plagues, or purely escapist books. I've had some comments of people asking for 1 week when I would do an escapist theme, which I think is a brilliant idea. And I will definitely do that sometime over the next month. I'm going to carry on doing every Wednesday night for the time being. And I'll be here for most of those Wednesday nights. But once a month, I will be hosted on Damien Barr's Literary Salon Facebook page. So next week, I'll be there, and the theme will be how to look after your home library, how to streamline it, how to cull it, how to improve it, how to dust it off and start again, how to make the most of your books in your own home library. So I'd love any of your further thoughts on any of those subjects. And thanks so much for joining me tonight. I'll just have a sip of my quarantini and then I'll see you next week. Good night. I'll wait here and I'll reply to comments this evening, and I will post the list of books at the end of the session on this Facebook page. Bye.